Thanks, everyone. It's so amazing to be here. And when you use the word legendary, I mean, we've heard from some real legends. And Elizabeth, thank you so much. It was just, I was remembering that when we had lunch at Yale, and remember we had that political conversation, and oh my gosh, there's so much to catch up on.
Ed, your slides are cut off. Can you go like full screen on the slides, please?
Somehow
it's okay on my screen. Is it?
Yeah, I'm seeing a full screen here. Let me go to my second one.
They look fine. They look fine to me. This is Leslie.
Here too.
I think they're okay.
Well, I think
they're good, Ed.
I think I used this slide at Yale, so I'm kind of double dipping here. But I hopefully Leslie will get a kick out of it. Leslie wrote that great book, Consciousness Explained Better, which is a response to, he should get an award for the best book title. It's also a great book in response to, not necessarily in response to, but following Daniel Dennett's famous or maybe infamous Consciousness Explained. Talk about an ambitious title. So hopefully the playfulness in that this comes out. I think improvisation is going to be the next frontier in terms of an ontology of consciousness. And improvisation is kind of an interesting topic when, I would say just stepping outside of consciousness studies for a second, even musicology does not really have much on improvisation except from, we know we have these legendary accounts of the European icons being consummate improvisers, Bach and Beethoven and Clara Schumann and so on, and Franz Liszt. And of course, the jazz tradition is, an improvisatory tradition. And but in terms of the process, we don't really have that much. And my work has been centered in recent years on going into the process from a consciousness-based standpoint. So now the question comes up: what might improvisation have to tell us about the nature of consciousness? And actually, I think when we look at it, it actually has quite a bit to tell us. So as Jeffrey mentioned from my bio, integral theory has been an important part of my work. And these couple of books are, from what I can tell, among the very first, if not the first, to really go into music from an integral standpoint. And I have to commend the organizers for setting up the sequence of talks. They really, I'm thinking from Barbara's talk a few talks ago, and then Michael's, and then of course Elizabeth, where there seemed to be building up to the non-dual theme, the relationship. I thought it was quite vivid in Barbara Carlson's talk about relationship of individuality and cosmos. And I think when we look at this through the lens of certainly consciousness, this is nothing new, although even if it's elusive in mainstream sort of science-based models of consciousness, although I think even at the Tucson meetings, I think we could generally say we're seeing a gradual orientation, a gradual shift in the direction of some kind of non-dual cosmic relationship. Well, when we look at this, so important to my work too is looking at this through the lens of creativity, at the heart of which is improvisation. There are other streams of creativity, and the field of music has an interesting template for us in having a very, very robust compositional creative stream that has co-evolved with improvisatory. And an interesting question as time goes on is which of those is composition or improvisation is primordial, if either. And my vision is predicated on improvisation as being a primordial cosmic process, that once we have that as an anchor, then we have this wonderful interplay between improvisatory and compositional and creativity. And of course, this the ramifications of this extend far beyond music. Painting, for instance, is a compositional kind of creativity. Although when we talk to painters, they will not infrequently talk about an improvisatory aspect of the process. but we can say that a painting is an object-mediated kind of creative endeavor, just like a notated composition is. The great thing about contemporary life is that we have access to all these things. So this idea, and Barbara went into this deeply, I don't know if she's still with us here, but this idea of self-reference, it's a huge, very powerful tool in terms of looking at these core epistemologies. So meditation can be thought of as a self-referential, self-referral procedure that's generally undertaken in silence. I realize there's many types of meditation. Going with a sort of a common sense of meditation is something that happens when one withdraws from typical activity. Improvisation, this is a little bit newer to the conversation. Improvisation can be thought of as self-reference in activity. And the jazz tradition is a real interesting tradition because, as we know, we have a long legacy of first-rate improvisers in jazz. It's being in terms of the music of the West, jazz is probably the most improvisatory. Indian music might be the most improvisatory, particularly North Indian and in the East. But in jazz, we have this legacy of improvisers who are also contemplatives. And I'm thinking of somebody like an Alice Coltrane, John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter. The list goes on and on. And when we, so let me frame this. What I'm getting at in terms of improvisation as an ontological tool, let me frame it in terms of the hard problem of consciousness. So we have what I've been proposing, and I think I spoke at Yale about this a year and a half ago. Well, we have the common hard problem of consciousness in consciousness studies that Chalmers, probably in the mid 90s, maybe the early 90s, framed. I'm calling it the first tier hard problem. So basically, it's usually framed something like this: how does subjective experience emerge from some kind of physical substrate? Now, there's a huge assumption in that question. And I think slowly the scientific mainstream or the consciousness studies mainstream is getting the assumption that it could be wrong. Subjective experience, maybe the question is wrong. How do we, how can we presume the subjective experience emerges? Maybe if subjectivity or consciousness is primordial, we have to flip that narrative on its head. Now, what I'm proposing as a second tier hard problem has to do with intersubjective creativity. So when we look at improvisers, and also we can say, those of us involved in meditation commonly report that the experience in groups is more vivid, more powerful. Not always. I've had a lot of experience for many, obviously on a daily basis, meditating by myself, but on occasions, at least once a year, meditating with extremely large groups, and it is something else. So I think there's reason to surmise that there's some kind of intersubjectivity, intersubjective consciousness is not some kind of not just some kind of poetic nicety. It's what you might say is ontologically veridical. It's a real thing. And we have in improvised music, so here's also, we come back to the improvisation meditation interplay here. Keep mindful of the time here, where improvisers commonly report very profound experiences of not only connection with their fellow players. Say if you're in an ensemble of 5 people, or it could be, as in the first image, a 20-piece improvising ensemble, which is kind of rare, or even one other person. There's very profound, heightened interconnectivity with the other players, but even with the audience. Improvisers often think about audience members as members of the ensemble. There's a kind of communion. And it's with my graduate students, we talk about this a lot. The question comes up, on some level, might audiences know when the music is being improvised? And this is in Elizabeth, I'm kind of thinking about your research here. I think there could be some way to measure this. It's just kind of an interesting question to tuck away. And there's also another connection here is, and this is very interesting to me. When we look at somebody was speaking about Maslow and the peak experiences and the plateau experiences, but in terms of peak experiences, when we look at accounts of composers' episodes of peak experience, we get a very different report than we do from improvisers' accounts, and they're both beautiful and powerful. But this kind of supports the idea that improvisation, which is, I should add, is commonly defined as kind of a subspecies of composition. And I think this is another example of an epistemology that's been reversed through a kind of materialist lens, where I think the stronger argument is emerging that improvisation is primordial. We don't have to go off so much on that. But the composers will talk about an instant in which huge sections of a composition, if not the whole form, like when we read Mozart's letters and letters from Brahms and Wagner and people like that, they're talking about sort of seeing like a finished composition in extraordinary detail, just sort of appearing. Now, somebody could say, well, isn't that improvisation? But just think about this, because the improvisers are talking about not an object mediated peak experience, as in a whole composition appearing, but in peak interactive transformations in consciousness. This intersubjective consciousness, this merging of players that I was talking about a second ago. So it's very paradigmatically different kind of reports of peak experience. And it's not to say that one is superior than the other, but it just supports the idea that we're talking about contrasting epistemologies that are not yet recognized as such, and have incredible things to do, or to things to offer our understanding of consciousness. So again, as I was just saying, that meditation can be thought of as self-reference in silence, improvisation, self-reference in activity. And so if you think about these in terms of continuums, you have some kind of, as Robert Foreman, who spoke at one of our meetings a year or two ago, would call the pure consciousness event, which we see across meditative traditions. We have higher states of consciousness. We have stages, more permanent things, aligning with Jeffrey's important research on the persistent non-symbolic experience. It was wonderful to see kind of an update on that today, Jeffrey. So we have a whole continuum of experiences. So the question is, when we're looking at these epistemologies as lenses into the nature of consciousness, the question is, what kind of consciousness, what model of consciousness would be conducive to such a range of experiences? And then actually, when we going to the non-dual, which has been coming up, culminating in, say, the Advaita, as Kumar was saying, or the non-dual experience, which is where the subjective epistemological account, which is oneness with the the cosmic self, the personal self is the cosmic self. So now we have personal subjective epistemology aligning with an ontological account. That's the Advaita model. Okay, so I mean, to me, that would be, there wouldn't be, just from an analytical standpoint, there wouldn't be many more, or any, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a more powerful sort of confirmation of the primacy of consciousness. And we can do the same thing through an improvisatory lens. Again, the question is, we're posing the question, what is consciousness? We have, within the improvisation-based line, heightened degrees of presence. So it's not just a matter of somebody being spontaneous, but just as with consciousness, there's degrees of spontaneity, degrees of, as I think about improvisation within improvisation, it's something that can be developed. just as consciousness can. We have heightened spontaneity. We have heightened, as I've been mentioning, experiences of interconnectedness. At which point, the higher stages, as they manifest in consciousness development, have direct maps or map directly with higher stages in improvisation or creativity-based experience. And this would be an interesting thing. Jeffrey, I'm thinking about the particularly like second, third, and fourth order PSNE stages in your model, correlations with sort of improvisatory creativity. I think there would be like a really, well, I mean, basically, I mean, there's a lot of alignment with those, with the general higher stage development of consciousness, so we could generalize that question. But I think that would be a rich area of investigation. And one of the things I do in my book is I draw correlates with the different stages of consciousness development and improvisatory development with the different models of consciousness. So we have this another continuum. We have strict reductionism. Leslie was talking about Dan Dennett's, reducing consciousness to neurocognitive algorithms and that kind of thing. We start moving away from strict reductionism, but still within materialism, we have epiphenomenalism. That is beginning to, I mean, that's where the hard problem, the first tier hard problem is posed, and is causing a lot of conundrums in the field. And Dave Chalmers, who framed the first tier hard problem, has been very, thankfully he has a sense of humor about it. But he'll the way he frames it, he says, first you come in as a reductionist, then you realize that doesn't work. You move on to being an emergentist or epiphenomenalist. You realize that doesn't work. Then you gravitate to dualism. Although he jumped from materialism to dualism very quickly. He said that you realize that doesn't work. Then you go to panpsychism. And then we can move on to non-duality. And which is, I think in his last speaking or writing, he's sort of in that zone, but although, not without a lot of kicking and screaming. But it's very, so we can we can correlate these with higher stages of improvisatory development, which raises very, to me, it draws a lot of coherence. Here's a couple of images of, I call this Tales of Two Epistemologies. These are some of my students at Michigan. We have a BFA in Jazz and Contemplative Studies. And that's pretty much a summary of what I've been talking about. I know I'm coming to the end here. Jeffrey, where am I? I have 5-6 minutes or so.
Yeah, you've got until probably 35 after is the absolute hard stop.
Okay, I want to leave a few minutes for questions. So tons of ramifications, again, especially when we start dealing with collective consciousness in improvisation and in meditation. In terms of ecology, social justice, my most recent book is Black Music Matters. And in another talk, I would go into the Black aesthetic, Afrofuturism, what I call integral jazz mysticism. There are powerful, I mean, this is, Black Lives Matter is sort of in the forefront right now. Black Music Matters has got to go along with Black Lives Matter. And there's a whole account of consciousness that's just waiting to be told in the mystical reservoir of the African-American cultural heritage. So it's, so I'm also in a parallel life here, not a past life or present life, a parallel life. I'm doing a lot of work with that. So I think what I'll do is keep that, oh, this is a nice one to keep up here. Maybe there's some questions. And I guess I would have to, should I sign out of the PowerPoint or maybe
there's I think there's a question from Gino. Hi, Gino. I saw you come in there. It's great to see you.
Hey, Gino.
Can you see it or you want me to read it to you?
If you could read it, that'd be great. Yeah.
Absolutely. We've been exploring eye contact and communication, identifying a distinction between embodied knowing and conceptual knowing. With this framework, maintaining eye contact and communication seems to be a residence of two bodies, embodied knowing. Could improvisation also be seen as such a co-resonance between the performer's embodied knowing?
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting. This is the second time embodiment has come up. Barbara brought it up very powerfully, probably an hour ago or something. But I think this is again a really important frontier in this, in terms of this whole intersubjectivity phenomenon. And it's really interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, if I had thought of it, I would have gotten some very powerful quotes as to the kind of intersubjective connection. I mean, musicians improvising together sometimes it's very dramatic, what you would call, you know, remote cognitive experiences, players. I mean, we've all heard it, or, you know, we've had it, you know, improvisation is something that happens in everyday life. We have it, you know, synchronicity. So this would be musical synchronicity, really vivid accounts of that I think align with what you're saying, Gina. Yeah.
I tell you, I have a question. I would love to, in the 3 minutes we have, assuming no other questions come in that we can prioritize from others, I'd love to hear more about that well that you're exploring in sort of a parallel way right now.
You mean related to Black Music Matters?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
you mentioned sort of a depth of sort of the consciousness on that side, you know, that sounded quite fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's just, I mean, this is such an interesting moment for this question and this dialogue. So in 3 minutes, now it's 2 minutes. You know, I mean, I'm approaching it from music studies, which is probably the most racist, inherently racist field in all of education. So there's a whole thing there. It's beginning to open up. Amazing dialogues are happening, but there's a conversation that needs to happen in society. So we're in the Black Lives Matter moment, and that's really important. But I think it's still kind of a we're still not taking the next step, in my view, of putting Black cultural contributions front and center. So for instance, if we step back from typical musical genre categories, and this is where improvisation is very helpful too, and just looked at the musical landscape, the influence of Black American music on, you know, certainly in the West, but even on the globe, is unsurpassed. I mean, there is no other musical tradition in the history of the world that has had such an impact on world.
Okay, let's go. Come on.
And this is a story that is not being told. And when you think about how that was able to happen against the circumstances of slavery, 4 centuries of enslavement, I mean, that makes it all the more unbelievable. Now, of course, the postmodernists will say, well, it's sort of a response. People had to dig deep into their creativity, you know, under oppression. Of course, that's part of it. And as integralists are great at celebrating postmodernism, but also realizing it's just part of the picture. When you look into it, like from the soul level, you know, African-American culture, I mean, it's so deep. I mean, it is like really, so yeah, so here we are. Alice Coltrane, Turya Sangitananta, your creating comes from the soul. That's where we're at.